What would you do if someone knocked on your door one morning and told you that something you built with your own two hands, on your own property, had to be torn down because they said so? No discussion, no compromise, just an order backed by empty threats and a clipboard full of nonsense rules. That's exactly what happened to me the day the HOA decided my fence was their latest target. It wasn't even some extravagant structure. No 10-foot-high fortress, no flashy custom design, just a simple wooden fence with wire mesh to keep my dog, Max, from running all over the neighborhood. It gave us a little privacy, blended in with the yard, and didn't block anyone's view. In other words, it was harmless. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA, you know logic doesn't factor into their decisions. That morning had been perfect. The sun was shining, my wife Jess was out front watering her plants, and the kids were laughing as they played in the yard. I stood back, admiring my handiwork, feeling proud that I'd finally finished a weekend project without something going horribly wrong. Then the doorbell rang. I wiped my hands on my jeans and went to answer it. Standing there on my porch was a man in a dark suit, sunglasses perched on his nose, gripping a clipboard like it was a weapon. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting, just cleared his throat like he had something important to say. I raised an eyebrow. "Can I help you?" He barely looked up from his paperwork. "Rick Thompson, HOA Compliance Officer." His voice was as flat as the pages he was flipping through. "I need to talk to you about your fence." My stomach sank. I already knew where this was going. "What about it?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. Rick finally looked up, his expression unreadable but carrying just the right amount of smug authority. "It's a violation of HOA regulations," he said. "It does not meet community standards and will need to be removed immediately." I blinked. "You're joking." Rick didn't flinch. "No. The HOA board has reviewed it and determined it's unsightly. You have 30 days to take it down, or you'll face penalties." I let out a sharp laugh, shaking my head. "I don't even belong to the HOA. I never signed any paperwork. You can't just come here and tell me what to do with my own property." Rick gave me a cold smile. "It doesn't matter. The HOA has rules that apply to everyone in this neighborhood, even those who have opted out. You'll need to comply, or we'll start issuing fines." I felt my blood start to boil. "So, let me get this straight. You're telling me that I have to tear down a fence I built, on my own land, just because you don't like it?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Rick replied. His tone was so matter-of-fact, so void of any actual reasoning, that it made my skin crawl. Before I could say another word, he turned on his heel and walked away, clipboard tucked under his arm like the conversation was already over. I stood there, staring after him, a storm of disbelief and anger building inside me. When I stepped back inside, Jess was in the kitchen, watching me with concern. "Who was that?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. "The HOA. They want me to tear down the fence." She frowned. "Why?" "It's not blocking anything. It's just for Max." "Because they said so," I muttered. Jess crossed her arms. "That's ridiculous." "Yeah, well, they don't care about what makes sense. They just want control." I ran a hand through my hair, my mind racing. I had two options. I could cave, take down the fence, and let them win. Or I could stand my ground. I glanced out the window at my yard, the yard I worked for, the home I was supposed to have a say in. I wasn't backing down. Not this time. I didn't waste any time. The moment Rick Thompson walked off my porch, I grabbed my laptop and started digging into the HOA's bylaws. If they were going to come after me, I needed to know exactly what I was up against. I wasn't some legal expert, but I could read between the lines, and after just an hour of scanning their website, I found something interesting. nowhere in their rules did it explicitly state that they had jurisdiction over private property belonging to homeowners who never signed the agreement. In fact, everything I read reinforced what I already knew: they had no real authority over me unless I let them. That gave me some hope, but I wasn't taking any chances. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer, Dan Mitchell. Dan had been a friend for years, and I'd helped him out with some paperwork a while back, so I figured he owed me one. When I told him what was going on, he let out a short laugh before getting serious. "They're bluffing," he said without hesitation. "They can't enforce HOA rules on you unless you agreed to be part of the HOA. They have no legal standing to make you do anything." "That's what I thought," I said, exhaling in relief. "But I have a feeling they're not going to back off that easily." "They won't," Dan agreed. "They'll try to intimidate you, make you feel like you have no choice. But don't give in. If they send fines, ignore them. If they escalate, we'll handle it." Hearing that made me feel a whole lot better, but I still had this nagging feeling in my gut. I knew people like Rick Thompson. People who got off on power, who didn't take no for an answer. If he had already decided I was his next target, he wasn't going to let this go. And I was right. 2 days later, I found out that several of my neighbors had started receiving violation notices from the HOA for the most ridiculous reasons imaginable. One guy got fined because his mailbox was supposedly the wrong shade of beige. Another was warned about his lawn being half an inch too high. And the worst? An elderly veteran, Mr. Jenkins, was given a notice demanding he take down his small American flag display because it wasn't in compliance with community standards. That's when I knew this wasn't just about my fence anymore. They were sending a message. I went next door to talk to Mike Anderson, one of the guys who got hit with a fine. He was standing in his yard, arms crossed, staring at the letter in his hand like it might burst into flames. "They ever bother you before?" I asked, nodding at the notice. Mike shook his head. "Never. I've lived here for 10 years and never got so much as a warning. But now, all of a sudden, they have a problem with my lawn?" I exhaled, feeling my anger deepen. Rick was trying to isolate me. He wanted my neighbors to turn against me, to make them afraid of what would happen if they sided with me. But that wasn't all. That night, I woke up to the sound of something cracking in my backyard. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, and immediately grabbed my phone. When I looked outside, my stomach dropped. A portion of my fence had collapsed. At first, I thought maybe the wind had knocked it over, or maybe the posts hadn't settled properly in the ground. But as I stepped outside with a flashlight, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The bolts holding the fence panels together had been deliberately loosened. I wasn't the paranoid type, but this wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. I turned on my security camera feed and started scrolling through the footage from earlier that night. At first, there was nothing. Just a quiet backyard, the occasional rustling of leaves. Then, at 2:37 a.m., 2 figures appeared on the screen. They weren't kids messing around. They weren't burglars. They were 2 men in dark clothes, sneaking along my fence line, tools in hand. I zoomed in, adjusting the resolution, and my stomach twisted. One of them was Rick Thompson. I sat there for a few seconds, staring at the screen, trying to process what I was looking at. The HOA, the same people who claimed they were all about community standards and keeping the neighborhood beautiful, had just trespassed onto my property in the middle of the night to sabotage my fence. I saved the footage, my hands shaking with anger. This was beyond petty fines and warnings. This was personal. By morning, I had already sent the footage to Dan and forwarded it to some of my neighbors, including Mike. The responses were immediate. People were furious. It was one thing to issue unfair fines, it was another thing entirely to sneak onto someone's property and damage it. And then, as if they weren't satisfied with just destroying part of my fence, the HOA doubled down. That afternoon, I checked my mailbox and found an envelope marked with the HOA's official letterhead. I tore it open and skimmed the contents, my anger boiling over with every word. They were fining me. Not for the original fence violation, but for having a damaged and unsightly structure on my property. The collapsed section of my fence, the part they had sabotaged, was now being used as an excuse to penalize me. They gave me 2 weeks to remove it or face additional fines. I gritted my teeth, barely able to believe what I was reading. This was war. I took a deep breath, looked down at the letter one more time, and then did the only thing I could think of. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. "Dan," I said, voice tight with fury. "They just made a huge mistake." I didn't waste time. The moment I hung up with Dan, I grabbed my laptop and started doing the one thing the HOA never expected me to do: dig into them. They had been so focused on bullying homeowners into submission that they never considered what would happen if someone fought back. They counted on intimidation, on people rolling over to avoid a fight. But I wasn't going anywhere. The first thing I did was look into their finances. If there was one thing I knew about organizations like this, it was that they always had something to hide. I started with public records, filings, annual reports, and any documents I could find related to the HOA's expenditures. It didn't take long before something caught my eye. The HOA collected thousands of dollars in fines every year, yet there were no major neighborhood improvements to show for it. Where was all the money going? The board was supposed to use those funds for maintenance and upgrades, but there hadn't been a new park bench installed in years. No new landscaping, no community events, just an ever-growing list of fines that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I needed more. And then I found it, the smoking gun. One of the board members had approved payments for consulting services to a company that didn't seem to exist anywhere outside of HOA records. The address listed led to a vacant office space. But the name on the approval? Linda Patterson. That was enough to tell me I was on the right track. But then, I found something even better. Linda Patterson, the same woman who had been spearheading the charge against my fence, had a fence of her own, one that completely violated the HOA's own rules. It took a bit of online searching, but there it was, a picture from a neighborhood event last year, clear as day. In the background of the photo was Linda's house, and sure enough, her backyard had a tall wooden fence. And not just any fence, it was the exact type of fence she had deemed unsightly on my property. I sat back, staring at the screen, a slow grin forming. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. Let's see how they liked it when the tables turned. I printed everything out: documents, screenshots, transaction records, the picture of Linda's fence, and put them all in a folder. Then I sent a copy to Dan, another to Mike, and a third to Alex Parker, the local journalist who had been looking into the HOA's corruption. That evening, I gathered with a few of my neighbors. When I laid out the evidence, the reaction was immediate. Mike let out a low whistle. "You mean to tell me that the same woman who's been coming after you for your fence has one just like it?" I nodded. "And not just that. The HOA's been bleeding money for years, and no one knows where it's going. But I think I have a pretty good guess." Everyone looked at each other, and I could see the anger building. The HOA had gone after all of us: fines, threats, intimidation, and the entire time, they weren't even following their own rules. We needed to make this public. The next morning, Alex Parker ran a front-page story with the headline, "Homeowner Fights Back, HOA President Found Violating Own Rules Amid Mysterious Financial Transactions." It was brutal. The article included the photo of Linda's fence, the shady financial records, and testimonies from multiple homeowners about unfair fines and intimidation tactics. The backlash was immediate. By noon, the HOA's office was flooded with calls from furious residents demanding answers. Social media blew up with people sharing their own horror stories about the HOA's corruption. Even people who had previously kept quiet were now speaking up. And then, as if things couldn't get any worse for them, the city zoning office called me. Apparently, after seeing the news article, someone from the zoning department decided to take a look at the false complaint the HOA had filed against me. Turns out, the forged signature on the complaint wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. That night, Dan called me. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, sounding more amused than concerned. "The city's opening an official investigation into the HOA for fraud." I leaned back in my chair, letting that sink in. "How bad is it?" "Bad," Dan said. "If they find out who actually submitted the forged complaint, it could mean legal trouble. Not just fines, criminal charges." I sat there for a moment, a slow satisfaction building. The HOA had spent weeks trying to tear me down, and now they were the ones in freefall. But I knew they weren't going to go down without a fight. And I was ready. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. The HOA's dirty secrets were out in the open, and the reaction was exactly what I hoped for: rage, disgust, and a collective realization that we'd all been played for fools. It wasn't just about my fence anymore. The entire community had been dealing with years of petty fines, intimidation, and unfair rules, all while the very people enforcing them were violating their own policies and pocketing money behind closed doors. It didn't take long for things to escalate. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered in front of the HOA office. At first, it was just a handful of frustrated neighbors, waving copies of the article and demanding answers. But as the hours passed, more people arrived: residents who had been unfairly fined, homeowners tired of the board's bullying, even some folks from neighboring communities who had their own horror stories about HOAs overstepping their boundaries. The signs started popping up: "Stop HOA abuse," "Where's the money?" and my personal favorite, "Linda's fence stays up, so does ours." I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the tension grew. Linda Patterson and her board hadn't made a public statement yet, and that silence was making things worse. People weren't just mad anymore, they were demanding action. That was when I got a text from Alex Parker. "Sources tell me the HOA is trying to rush through a rule change. Emergency meeting today at 4 p.m. They're going to retroactively adjust the regulations so they can legally fine you and others. You need to be there." I stared at my phone in disbelief. They were doubling down. Instead of backing off, instead of admitting they were wrong, they were trying to rewrite the rules to justify the corruption they'd already committed. That wasn't going to happen. I made some quick calls to Dan, Mike, and a few of the most vocal neighbors. If they wanted to push their agenda in secret, we were going to make sure they had an audience. By the time 4 p.m. rolled around, the HOA office was packed. The board members sat at the front, looking noticeably nervous as they shuffled papers and whispered to each other. Linda wasn't even making eye contact with anyone. The second they tried to introduce their new, fine structure adjustments, which was just legal jargon for giving themselves the power to punish us retroactively, Dan stood up. "That's not going to fly," he said coolly, holding up a stack of documents. "Retroactive rule changes are not enforceable under contract law. You fine someone for violating a rule before that rule existed, and you're looking at a lawsuit you won't win." The room erupted. Neighbors started shouting. "You can't rewrite the past just to cover your tracks. Where's the money, Linda? You break your own rules, and now you want to change them?" Linda looked like a deer caught in headlights. She stammered something about preserving community integrity, but nobody was listening anymore. The crowd had turned on them. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse for them, a manila envelope slid onto the table in front of the board. I turned to see a city zoning official standing in the back. "The city has opened an investigation," he announced. We need access to your financial records and documentation regarding recent enforcement actions. We have reason to believe fraudulent reports were filed on behalf of this HOA. Dead. Silence. Linda went pale. One of the board members, a guy in a cheap suit who had been backing Linda up all meeting, immediately grabbed his briefcase and bolted out of the room. The others just sat there, eyes darting between each other, realizing they had just lost control. Dan smirked. I'd suggest you all stop whatever you're doing and start looking for a lawyer. You're going to need one. I folded my arms and watched as the chaos unfolded. The board members tried to adjourn the meeting, but nobody was leaving. The community wasn't letting them get away with it this time. By the time the meeting ended, two things were clear. The HOA had been caught red-handed, and now the city was involved. This wasn't just a battle over my fence anymore. It was the beginning of the end for the HOA as we knew it. And we weren't stopping until we took them down for good. The fallout was immediate. Within 24 hours of the meeting, word spread like wildfire. The city's investigation into the HOA's finances had officially begun, and homeowners were demanding answers. The HOA board, once so confident in their control, was now scrambling to save face. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and they knew it. The first to go was Rick Thompson. Whether he resigned or was pushed out, no one knew for sure, but his departure was announced in an impersonal HOA email that conveniently avoided mentioning any of his past intimidation tactics. One down. Next came the board members who weren't ready to face the heat. One by one, they stepped down, citing personal reasons as their excuse. The truth was clear, they knew the lawsuits were coming, and they wanted out before the flames got any higher. More falling dominoes. But the real prize? Linda Patterson. For days, she stayed silent, refusing to comment on the allegations. But when the city formally subpoenaed the HOA's financial records and the news ran another exposé about her fence hypocrisy, she finally cracked. She resigned effective immediately, leaving behind a crumbling organization and a neighborhood that had turned against her. With the board in shambles, the HOA had no choice but to scrap their ridiculous rules, refund unjust fines, and restructure entirely. The homeowners, once afraid to speak out, were now the ones rewriting the regulations. The overreach, the intimidation, the arbitrary rules, it was over. And as for my fence? It never came down. It stood exactly where I built it, a symbol of everything we fought for. Every time I looked at it, I saw more than just wood and nails. I saw a victory against bullies who thought they could control us. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt different. People talked more, checked in on each other, and stood together in ways they never had before. We weren't just a collection of houses anymore. We were a community. So, was it worth it? Every late-night strategy session, every ounce of frustration, every fight to prove we had rights? Absolutely. The HOA thought they could push us around, but they underestimated one thing: what happens when a community unites against corruption. What about you? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.